Joining me now is my friend and colleague, Joy Reid, host of The Read Out on MSNBC. Joy, thank you for pulling double duty, my friend. I'm so eager to hear your thoughts about this, this rally that we heard tonight. Admittedly, some of the lines we've heard before, there was some new material too. I thought Harris was as electrifying and as enthusiastic and excited, honestly, as she has been in the course of this campaign. But I do wonder what you make of the kind of careful calibration that both she and Barack Obama had to make between, characterizing Donald Trump as an aging grifter worthy of derision and laughter on one hand, but also a looming threat to democracy and someone who will be very, very dangerous if reelected. How did you feel about it, and how did you feel about this sort of calibration there?
Well, I'll tell you, I watched the lead up and the beginning of the Kamala Harris speech and obviously the Obama speech during my show, sitting next to Valencia Johnson, who worked on President Obama's 2008 campaign. She's a veteran of the Obama universe. And one of the things we both noted is that there's nothing more delightful than Barack Obama's delight at his own performance. Like, he enjoys himself so much. He is so back in the groove. And his stump speech that he's rolled out, that he's added some things to, including, of course, informing people about the Hitler love that we've now heard John Kelly report regarding the former president. So I think he's completely in his game. He's in his element. One wonders if, he had been called on to the Sherry Beasley campaign in North Carolina, what difference he could have made there. So it is a good thing to have these two political phenoms together. And I just have to say, just as a cultural moment, to have the first black president there to send up what could be the second black president and first Asian American and first woman president was actually something that was pretty culturally incredible to see them back together, longtime political allies. But yes, I think the purpose of these speeches, particularly in a place like Georgia that's already voting, in addition to the obvious entertainment value of having a Tyler Perry and a Spike Lee and a Samuel L. Jackson and a Bruce Springsteen there to rile up the crowd, is also to get to voters who don't necessarily watch us, right? We wish everyone was watching us and watching MSNBC. And we want them to, but not everybody is getting their information from cable news. And so there are voters who exist in the universe of more pop culture who may not have heard that Donald Trump's former chief of staff said that he liked Hitler and would like to rule like Hitler. And so the important thing into going into these early voting states is to get that soundbite in front of people who are not only physically there inside the arena, but onto the local news, to force that information outside of the MSNBC, CNN universe, to force it into even people who might get some of their information from Fox. Every chance that they're getting, they are getting this news out. They're making sure that people know what Donald Trump is, while at the same time leaning into their advantage in terms of the culture. One of the best lines tonight was actually from Tyler Perry, who talked about America as a quilt and saying that that's the America we want. What we don't want, in his words, is a candidate that sees America as a sheet. Yeah. Powerful words from Tyler Perry. Wow. And so I think tonight it was pretty important culturally, but substantively as well. Yeah, and I would say to that Tyler Perry metaphor, when you think of white sheets, what do you think of but especially in Georgia? Yeah, especially in Georgia. Joy, when you talk about Barack Obama and the joy he has on the campaign trail and how much he's in his groove, he's doing something that he did not do, as far as I can recall, in previous election cycles, which is reminding people of the economy he gave Republicans, and particularly Donald Trump, the pandemic playbook that his administration wrote that would have, in his words, and I think likely given Trump's mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic, would have potentially saved many American lives. He did that tonight, too. Let's take a listen to that.
When I was president, we put together an entire playbook for how to deal with a pandemic. And when Donald Trump came in, we gave him that playbook. And he, I guess, dropped it in the dustbin. Some folks will be like, well, Donald Trump sent me a check. I'm sure y'all understand this. Joe Biden sent you a check during the pandemic, just like I gave people relief during the Great Recession. The thing is, we didn't put our name on it because it wasn't about feeding our egos. It wasn't about advancing our politics. It was about helping people. That's the difference. I've heard people say this, right? I'll talk to them. Why would you think about voting for this guy? Well, I remember the economy when he first came in. It was pretty good. Yeah, it was good because it was my economy. I handed over 75 straight months of job growth to Donald Trump. And all he did was give tax cuts to folks who didn't need it, drove up the deficit in the process, and now he wants to do it again. You can't give him credit for that.
This feels so overdue. This fact check is so important, and I honestly wish that somebody would make it. It's great to have Obama make the case, but honestly, Democrats should have been saying this for months now. I think it's effective. What do you think, Joy?
Absolutely. Look, to quote the great political pundit Plies, one of my favorite follows on the Instagram, rapper Plies, you got to brag on your ish. And Democrats have been terrible at bragging about the stuff they've done. And I wish President Obama had done it when he was president. Democrats are about putting their heads down and doing the work. They don't want to brag, they don't want to boast.
Not signing the check because they don't want to be about egos. Sorry to interrupt.
They don't want to be about ego, and they just believe in doing the work. But here's the thing. America is the Tubi nation. America wants the entertainment. America wants the constant entertainment and the sort of ratchet value. They really want to know what you're doing and be constantly entertained and communicated to. And so here's the reality. Donald Trump did one really smart political move, which is to violate all prior, propriety and stick his name above the Treasury Secretary's name on those stimmy checks that he didn't give. As Barack Obama accurately said, that was Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi who gave out those checks. But so many low information voters are voting based on those stimmy checks, and they are talking directly to working class voters of color who will tell Don Lemon when he's interviewing them on the street that they're voting based on the stimmy. They need to break that information logjam and get people to understand where that stimulus check came from, that is core Democratic policy. And that when Donald Trump came in, he was golfing while President Obama's economy was cooking. It was Obama's economy he was living on. That's why he had time to play golf, because he really didn't do much as president except spend down and basically squander all of the bounty that Barack Obama left him by giving it to billionaires like Elon Musk, who are now funding him to keep the tax cut. This is key information. Those are the clips that the Kamala Harris, Tim Walz campaign want clipped and socialized so that people can get out of this information bubble and this lie that Donald Trump had a great economy. No. President Obama had a great economy, handed it to this man who squandered it, and then messed up COVID and ended the great economy and plunged us into a recession that then the cleanup man, Biden, and his co-conspirator and cleanup woman, Kamala Harris, had to fix.
I will say the Democrats' management of the American economy is not just a good thing in the past. It is, regardless of what the polling tells you, Biden has managed this American economy in a fashion that is unprecedented. I was told today that the median American income is the highest it has been in modern American history right now. That doesn't account for inflation, but that's what's real. That's what's happening now. And I don't know, is Joe Biden going to have to go out on the campaign trail in the next election cycle and remind people of that? Let's hope not. Joy Reid, host of The ReidOut, airing weeknights at 7 p.m. right here on MSNBC. It is a thrill and a joy to see you twice in a day, my friend. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you.